Okay, so today I actually want to look at pawn structures. I know Lucas had mentioned this to me before, and it's not something we'd really touched on as a topic by itself. I mean, in the process of studying openings, we kind of touched on this, but maybe we should spend some more time on it. Not even this time, but maybe even future lectures too. Because a lot of times, I was just thinking recently about if I have to explain a position to someone, it's based a lot about the pawn structure. So I think this is a good starting point. Um, Now, we'll start off with the French structure, just because it's kind of classic in a sense. It was one of the pawn structures that was first kind of heavily analyzed. Nimzovich and Tarrasch, these people really analyze this kind of pawn structure. And also, if you guys have read The Art of Attack in Chess, this is a very common pawn structure that comes up in that book. Um, so with pawn structures, there's a couple of things that you guys need to know. You need to know the kind of pawn breaks that are available or that you should aim for. And you also want to know where your pieces go, right? So starting out with the French structure here, which if you take away all the pieces, it's just e5 and d4 versus d5 and e6. Very, very common pawn structure, not just from the French defense. You'll also see this kind of pawn structure in the Caro-Kann. You'll see it happen in the Slav. You'll see it happen in even openings like the Queen's Indian. It's very common. So don't think that because you don't play e4, for instance, that you're never going to encounter this. Okay. And also don't think that if you don't play the French, you're never going to encounter it. Like I said, if you play the Caro-Kann, this is an important pawn structure you should understand. If you play the Slav, even the Queen's Indian, this kind of thing happens. So anyway, it's really important. So one of the first things I'll point out is that in this kind of pawn structure, white generally does not want to play f4. Generally, okay? There are some exceptions like the classical French, but that's a rare one. Typically, you don't want to play f4 because you'd be blocking the bishop on c1. Okay, so for instance, if this were just a French advance, and it is, except white has like an extra, couple moves, but you never want to play f4 in that opening because you want to keep that bishop open on that diagonal. Now another thing I want to point out is where your light squared bishop goes. Where does everyone think your light squared bishop generally wants to be here? With white, I mean. Where should your light squared bishop be developed?
I usually think b5, but black has an easy answer to it, so I usually like d3.
Yeah, this b1 h7 diagonal for this bishop is almost always the right destination. It's just really active there, helping support a kingside attack. In the Art of Attack in chess, they go over all these examples of the Greek gifts where you sacrifice an h7, play knight g5, queen h5, that kind of thing. So yeah, it almost always belongs on this diagonal. Yeah, in this structure, in this case, bishop b5 doesn't make sense because black could just block it with a pawn, right? But even if black couldn't block it with a pawn, imagine the c pawns are missing. It's still not the right spot for the bishop. Another thing worth pointing out is that the light squared bishop is your good bishop, so you don't want to be exchanging it, especially for black's counterpart, right? And another thing worth pointing out is the knight on b1. This can be a piece that you'll have problems finding a good square for if you don't know what to do with it. Because it's common in this kind of position. Let's just say, for instance, bishop d3, c5, c3. A lot of times the pawn will come to c3, so it takes away the most natural square for that knight, right? So how do we get into the game? Well, you're usually going to go through d2, and from there you can go to f1, and then usually g3 to help support a kingside attack. Maybe from there go to h5. Now there's an idea too to put the knight on c2 via a3 in order to support the d4 square. So this is an idea too, but for the most part you're going to be going through d2 to f1 and then over to the king side to help a kingside attack.
Would you do that before or after castling?
That's a good point. One thing I also want to note about this pawn structure is that, generally speaking, neither side really needs to be in a hurry to castle. And the big reason for that is because the center is closed, right? If there's pawns on e5 and d4 and e6 and d5, there's no central files where your king is going to get attacked by a rook easily. So generally speaking, white's going to want to not be too anxious to castle. I'm not saying delay it forever, but if you can play useful moves before castling, it'll be good. Like in some cases, playing knight to 2 f1 to g3 can save you a tempo later on. So you don't have to play rook e1 and then move your knight there, right? Because moving your rook to e1 may or may not be useful in this kind of position. Another idea or reason for delaying castling as white would be that you can utilize your rook on the h file. So let's just play some silly moves, for instance. Let's see, whose move is it here? c3. Let's say something like, I don't know, knight e7. Let's say knight d2. Let's say your opponent just plays really dumb and now, okay, it's not going to let me castle, but because I created this position just from scratch. Anyway, assume black castled here. You could then play bishop takes h7, knight g5, and bring your queen over to the king side with, the Greek gift sacrifice, right? So delaying castling has that advantage too. You'll see this all the time in the window where white playing a move like h4. And likewise as black, especially like in this position, castling isn't really that important of a move to make here. Your king's not exactly in any danger, and it's not like castling brings your rook to a really fantastic position. So instead, it's worthwhile to try to attack white's center, play something like queen b6, and put pressure on it instead. So yeah, just general note there, when pawns are in this kind of structure, you don't want to be anxious to castle for either side. And yeah, bishop usually goes to d3, and your knight on the queen side migrates to the king side in that fashion. So that's just, some various ideas that you have, ways to improve your position. And so that's from white's perspective. Now, going back to the start here. Let's look at this from black's point of view. So white has a space advantage, and that lets white get some prospects on the king side. Now, how do you get counterplays black? I already kind of mentioned one of them. One idea is, for instance here, to just put pressure on d4. So you're going to play queen b6, maybe play knight e7, maybe knight f5, and just try to put pressure on the d4 pawn. That's a really big theme when white has this pawn structure. Really one of the best ways is attacking the base. When I say base, I mean d4, right? You want to take on d4, for instance, yeah, it won't let me castle again. Say something like this. You want to play queen b6 in a position like this. And here, for instance, white would actually have no way of defending the pawn, so we'd have to take on c5 or something like that.
Can you also play queen b3 in this position?
Yeah, another point I would say is almost always in these structures, you don't want to play queen b3 as white. Here, for instance, tactically, the reason would be c4, and white has to trade queens, and white and black, gets good play on the queen side. Plays for b4. But in any case, just generally speaking, white doesn't want to go into an endgame in this kind of position. White's best play resides with an attack, so you want to keep queens on the board for the most part. Doesn't mean all endgames are bad for white, but you're going to want to keep queens on the board for more winning chances. So yeah, attacking d4 is one way to play for black. Another way is to play f6. So you can chip away at the front of the pawn to try to eliminate white's space advantage, or at least part of it, on the king side. So those are your two basic breaks. Attacking d4 is ideal, but sometimes it's not always easy or that great. So the other idea is to attack the front of it with f6. But I will also say, when you play f6, you do have to be careful if you're castled or not. It does matter. Just for example, in this case, white could play something like knight h4, and queen h5 is very nasty to deal with, right? So if you are going to play the f6 break, just be wary of your king position. Now for piece placement. One piece that can be awkward to deal with, since white's pawn on e5, is knight on g8. So typically that piece is going to head for basically a couple possible destinations, or several really. One way to develop it is via h6. The advantage of developing over here is that you're not blocking your bishop's development or guardianship of the c5 pawn. And this way you're obviously going to be heading for the f5 square where you put pressure on d4. Now an alternative way of developing it would be to g6. So the idea would be to play knight e7, knight g6. And it'll help safeguard your king so there's no bishop takes h7 tactics. And it'll help when you play f6 later, and if white takes, to guard the e5 square. The e5 square can be very useful to keep an eye on.
I always see that when I play against the French, they almost inevitably route that knight to f5. And it's frustrated me so many times. I've wondered if I should just play, if I could play g4 or something to try to kick that knight away, because it's so, that knight becomes a big thorn in my side.
Okay, so that's a good point. So just look at a concrete position. Let's look at the advanced French, for instance. So let's say knight c6, knight f3, for instance, bishop d7, and let's see what's a good. I mean, there's basically two main lines here for white: a3 and bishop e2. I know I'm already violating the point I made earlier about the bishop being best along this diagonal. The issue with playing bishop d3 here, by the way, is purely tactical. It is possible. It's called the Milner-Berry gambit, but the problem is c takes, and queen b6. And the attack on d4 is hard to meet since bishop b3 loses b2, and if you play bishop c2, trying to guard the pawn and keep the bishop on this diagonal, it runs into knight b4. And black is able to exchange off the bishop. If white tries to retain it, black has some annoying ideas. So for tactical reasons, unfortunately, in the French advance, you have to usually put it on e2. But in any case, let's say something like bishop e2, for instance, knight h6, castle, knight f5. So in these kind of positions, g4 is pretty double-edged. It's definitely an idea. It's not always good. In this case, I think it's probably okay. But you do have to be careful when you play g4 because it really does weaken your king. A more solid idea, if you don't want to play g4, is to play knight a3 followed by knight c2 in this kind of position. Just to guard d4. And the other reason you do that is because your knight can't go to d2 since you would just lose a d4 pawn. So yeah, for instance, knight a3 would be perfectly fine here. And of course, in these positions as white, you're never concerned about black taking on a3 because now black's dark squares are just very weak in general. So yeah, that's one idea. But putting knight on f5 isn't black's only choice here. Another very reasonable and very good idea is knight e7. And against this, just for example, let's say white goes along the theme of delaying castling and plays like knight a3, trying to play knight c2. Now knight g6 is the other possible idea here. Now, for instance, let's say knight c2, bishop e7, and now let's say g3. By the way, just one thing I'll note in this pawn structure for black. Let's say white played bishop d3 here, castles, and then bishop takes g6. So how do you guys think black should recapture here? Yeah, f takes. Just a general rule in this pawn structure, e5, d4, d5, e6. When white takes on g6 like that, f takes g6 is almost always the right idea for a couple reasons. One is that it opens up the f-file for your rook. And two is that picking with the h-pawn can just be really dangerous. White, for instance, can play h4, followed by knight g5, moving the queen over, h5, and your king can get under quite some pressure. So just know as black, however white manages to trade a piece on g6, usually f takes g6 is the right way to recapture. I'm just mentioning that because it's not very intuitive, because you're taking it away from the center, and you're eliminating the possibility of playing f6 and breaking up the pawns, right? Okay. In any event, let's say white plays something better like g3, castles, and h4. An idea worth remembering for black is the knight can go to h8. So for instance, f6, h5, and knight h8. And black's not winning, but he's happy enough. It may seem really passive to put the knight there, but don't worry, it's not going to stay. Black's going to put it on f7. So it's only temporarily out of the game. So yeah, that illustrated a couple ideas there. White delaying castling and getting space on the king side, and why black's knight might go to g6, and where it can go from there. Now there's a third possibility for that knight other than g6 or f5, and that's the queen side. So another possibility is for black to play knight c8, and then for instance knight c2, knight b6. So the knight can head for the queen side, possibly c4. Black might aim to play rook c8, c takes d, and open up the queen side. That's a definite idea too. So basically, if you're black and you're trying to figure out where to put the king side knight, you have those, generally speaking, those three possibilities. Put on an f5 on g6, or you can add to the queen side on b6. Okay, so we looked at white's ideas in this position, and we've looked at black's pawn breaks at c5 and f6, and where to put that knight. So yeah, I think that's pretty much it. Now, I can't cover everything. If you want to look at white's attacking ideas in this kind of position, the art of attack in chess I mentioned earlier really goes over a lot better detail how to attack with white in this kind of position. Okay, so now let's move on to another structure, the Slav structure. Now, right after I have the Caro-Kann-Rubinstein structure, they're really closely related. So, in this classical Slav structure right here, white has an extra center pawn, but black doesn't intend for that to be permanent. Generally speaking, black wants to play c5 in this position. e5 can be an idea as well, but usually c5 is better since we would eliminate one of white's center pawns. Okay. Now, just to show you a concrete position this can come from, let's say d4, d5, c4, c6, knight f3, knight f6, knight c3, and now d takes c4, a4, bishop f5, e3, e6, bishop takes. So if you see the pawn structure is the same, except white has the pawn at a4, but basically the same idea. So black wants to play c5, but black has to be careful about the timing. For instance, c5 here is not good. White has a couple good options, either bishop b5 check or d5, and black is unable to exchange that c pawn for the d pawn. So black has to be careful about preparing it. Usually have to develop first. So black is much more likely to just play bishop b4, for instance, castle, castle, and continue developing like so. Now, going back to the pawn structure here. So we know that black's idea is to play c5. So you might wonder, what's white up to? Yeah, white wants to play e4. So for example, in this position, queen e2 is a big idea. White wants to play the pawn to e4. And I'm not going to get too much into the theory here, but let's just say, for instance, bishop g6. The idea of bishop g6, by the way, is to stop white from playing e4. Since if you play e4, bishop takes e3 wins the pawn, right? So white has to delay a little bit, play bishop d3. Now, for instance, let's say knight bd7, e4, say rook c8, e5, knight d5. And here's another example of paying attention to the pawn structure. If bishop takes g6 here, you want to play f takes g6. For pretty much the same reason as before, you're opening up your rook on the f-file, and you're preventing issues related to knight g5. For instance, if you played h takes here, knight g5 would be very dangerous. White's idea is very simple, just to play queen g4, queen h4, and, well, checkmate you. And it's not at all actually easy to stop that. So playing f takes g6 doesn't leave you susceptible to this problem. For instance, if knight g5, you could play queen e7, and h6 later, you can kick the knight away. So white wants to play e4, maybe e5 and gain more space. E5 isn't really necessary either. White could just, for instance, try to continue developing. Let's say bishop f4. But in any case, white's going to want to maintain this pawn pair somehow, either d4 and e5 or d4 and e4. And black's going to want to engineer c5 in a good situation. Okay. So does anyone have any questions about this pawn structure? Generally speaking, this pawn structure is dominated by central play. Usually there's no really wing attacks. Most of the play is centered around controlling the center.
Considering the semi-open file, would black ever castle queenside here?
Yeah, that's really rare. Yeah, almost always both sides are going to castle kingside.
Right.
White almost always castles kingside because the c file is open, and for the same reason, black castles kingside because the c file is open. So yeah. Now, interestingly enough, changing just the position of one pawn from an e pawn to a c pawn makes a big difference. Now, in these positions, white's best chance for getting an advantage is actually castling queenside. It doesn't mean castling queenside is always the best or right idea in these kind of positions, but it is usually the critical idea for getting an opening advantage. So just for example, let's look at a really topical line in the Carlsbad. So for instance, look at this. Now in this position, white almost always castles queenside. So for example, bishop d2, knight f6, and castles queenside. So that's just a big topical line. For one thing, in this particular position, castling kingside, you risk having a weak h5 pawn, since the rook would be on the h file. The other reason is just that since white has so much space, you don't want to put your king over there after gaining that. You want to use it later, hopefully play g4, maybe f4, and attack over there. But even so, without that, let's go back. For example, if white played like knight f3, knight d7, bishop d3, this is generally considered really tepid for white. This kind of position, white doesn't really have much chance for advantage because it's hard to say where you attack. If you attack on the king side now, your king is over there, so you can't really launch a successful pawn storm. So going back to the pawn structure, yeah, again, generally speaking, you're going to want to castle kingside. Now, this structure doesn't just happen from the Carlsbad, by the way. It also comes up from the Rubinstein. So in the Rubinstein, e4, e6, d4, d5, knight c3, d takes, knight d7, say knight f3, knight f6, bishop g5. Let's say, for instance, bishop b7, knight takes, bishop d3. So in this position from the Rubinstein, white almost always tries to castle queenside. So something like queen e2 and castles queenside are almost always white's next two moves here. Because again, if you just castle kingside here, it's not easy to figure out how you can really get a decisive advantage. And likewise for black, almost no matter what, you're going to want to play c5. c5 is your big break in this pawn structure. So for example, let's say castles, queen e2. c5 is far and away your best idea here. Because if you let white just maintain that space advantage in the center, he's going to castle queenside and then just launch the g and h pawns at you. And you're not going to have much counterplay. So one point of c5 is to chip away at white's advantage in the center, but also to open up the queen side. Opening up the c file will be really beneficial for trying to get an attack going. So in this pawn structure, achieving c5 is important, and it's the same way in the Carlsbad. So let's go back to this Carlsbad position. Let's see. Okay. So going back to this Carol-Con position, for example, bishop e7, king b1. A big move here is c5. Trying to open up the queen side, castle king side, and try to attack white where the king is over there. So black's ideas are the same, despite maybe slightly different piece and pawn placements. And in both positions, castle and king side isn't really going to get you very far. You got to castle queen side as white and attack on the king side. So any questions on this pawn structure? It really ends up being pretty tactical. In terms of your strategical ideas, they're pretty narrow. Okay. Now another big pawn structure that happens a lot is the King's Indian pawn structure. And it can come apart from a lot of different openings. So it's really worth knowing. Even if you don't play d4 as white, you still need to know it. And even if you don't play the King's Indian as black, you still need to know it. Let me just give you an example where, let's say you're white and you think the King's Indian structure can never happen. So let's say e4, e5. So let's say you play the Ruy Lopez, right? You think, the King's Indian is not something you need to understand. Black can play the Smyslov with g6. And now let's say you play natural moves, like say you play c3, now d6, d4, bishop d7, say castle. And here you think, oh, I'll grab space and do this. And then, suddenly we end up with, guess what? The King's Indian pawn structure. So just because you don't play d4 as white or queen pawn opening, and just because you don't play the King's Indian as black, doesn't mean that you can't get into these kind of positions. So it is very important to know. In any case, the big important thing behind this pawn structure is basically e4, d5 versus e5, d6. And I also look at it in reverse too. With white, this is not an uncommon thing to aim for. So if you think about it, it's basically the exact opposite of the French structure we're looking at, right? Instead of d4, e5, you have e4, d5. Now in this kind of position, your attacking potential as white is, for the most part, going to be on the queen side. That's going to be where your advantage lies. So white's big break here is to play something like c5, try to open up the c file and invade. And for black, the big idea is to play f5 and get space on the king side with perhaps f4 and attack on the king side. So you have a couple different ideas there. Now, just going back to the analysis board. I don't want to get too much into the theory of the King's Indian, but there are some special positional points I want to get into. So let's look at a simple King's Indian. Oops. Castle, bishop b2. So sometimes in this pawn structure, your knight's going to be on b8. Sometimes it's going to be on e7. So let's say now, for instance, a5 and knight a6. So when your knight's on b8, it's a big idea to try to put it on c5. And you almost always want to play a5 to repair it. And the reason, by the way, is that if you just played, for instance, knight a6, let's say castles, well, instead of castles, let's say, for example, queen c2. Now if you play knight c5, white can just play b4, and you have to waste another move with your knight. And meanwhile, white's played a useful move in the form of b4, getting space on the queen side, right? So if your knight's on b8 and you want to get it to c5, you need to repair it with a5. So a5, castle, knight a6. And for white, there's something to beware of. So let's say, for instance, queen c2, knight c5. So you want to play b4, right? So let's say, for example, you play a3. Now black plays something like, I don't know, bishop d7. And since b4 black could just take it because of the pin, let's say you played rook b1. Black has a very powerful move now. Black to play, what do you guys think black should do? Well, c6 would give white what he wants, playing b4. So you want to maintain that knight on c5. How do you do that? You can play a4. So this just stops b4 in its tracks, and even if white does arrange b4 later, for instance, if white plays knight d2 and you play b4, you can always play a takes b3. And white will then fracture his pawn structure and won't be able to force your knight from c5 anyway. So with white, this is not what you want. And if black, if you achieve this, then you're in a great situation, because now the queen side is stabilized and closed. You can begin your attack on the king side without hindrance. So you can play like knight e8, f5, and just go with your typical attack. So with white, in these positions, you need to make an important preparatory move and play b3. And by the way, even going back here, after a3, if you want to be really precise, a4 would put white in a bad spot. So if you want to kick the knight out and you're white, you want to play b3, then a3, and then b4. Because if you play a3 first, black can play a4, and you're never going to be able to play b4 without allowing black a takes b3. So with white, you need to know not to allow that, and as black, keep in mind this a4 idea, keeping white's queen side at bay. So putting the knight on c5 is one idea. But in a lot of cases, if you play pure King's Indian, the knight is going to end up on e7. So just for instance, normally the game would go castles, knight c6, d5, knight e7. And we have the beginning of the Mar del Plata, right? Now, when you're playing the King's Indian, you have basically three general ways you can play. You can go for an all-out kingside attack and just ignore whatever white's doing on the queen side. So for example, one way that happens is like knight e1, black can play like knight e8, and just play f5, f4, g5, h5, and just try to attack on the king side. You can just completely ignore the queen side, but you don't have to. Another way you can do it is you can try to play c6 and open up the queen side yourself. Now typically it's not a good idea if your knight's on e7. You actually usually want it to be able to go to c5. So in these Mar del Plata positions, unfortunately, playing on the queen side doesn't work out too well. But if we go back to earlier, when white played, for example, in early d5, in these positions you can play like c6, and after castles, you could, for example, takes, by knight d7, and play on the queen side with, for example, maybe a6, b5, knight c5, and try to play over there. So you have a couple ways of doing it. This is a little bit less risky than just going for checkmate or bust on the king side. So it may appeal to you if you don't want to take such risks in the opening. Okay, so that's the King's Indian pawn structure, and I switched it around for white because even if you don't play d4, you can still face it in the form of if white plays it. White can play the King's Indian attack against you with the exact same ideas. So knowing how to handle the position from either side is pretty important. Okay. Now Benoni structure. This doesn't really occur in too many openings unless you play d4 as white. For example, if you never move your d pawn to d4, you're not going to get into this kind of structure. And likewise as black, if you don't play something like the Sicilian or Benoni or Benko, you're not going to end up in this kind of position. But it's important for you if you do. So in general in this position, black's pawn break is going to be on the queen side. Black wants to play a6 and b5. Now if you play the Benko, you're just going to be missing those pawns. You're not going to have any a or b pawns, and white's going to be missing the c pawn. And in those positions, you're just going to be aggregating your pieces on the queen side, right? We looked at that before in the Benko lecture. But if you play an old Benoni, then playing for a6, b5 is an important idea. And as white in these positions, your play is almost always in the center or on the king side. So you're going to aim for this e5 pawn break, or you're going to attack on the king side. So you might play f4, and then either supporting e5, or you might play f5. F5 would lead to kind of a Grand Prix style attack, right? You might play queen e1, knight f3, knight g5, queen h4, that kind of thing. So those are your basic ideas in this pawn structure. Now, modern Benoni can be a little bit more complicated. These positions are more open. Um, it's more dicey for both sides. For one, black has a permanent backwards pawn on d6, right? But black also has the open e file in return. So it's kind of good and bad. Now, in these positions, as far as black is concerned, the dark squared bishop is a hugely important piece. You almost never want to exchange that for anything. You'll even sacrifice the exchange to keep it. And as far as your knights go, you're almost always going to want to get a knight to e5 if you can. And you may wonder about that because white can easily dislodge it with a move like f4. And it's for that reason that sometimes black will play knight e5 and then g5. So that when white plays f4, he can just take it and maintain that knight there. So getting a knight to e5 is a big idea. G5 is an idea occasionally. Now, also in general, as far as black's concerned, you're going to expand on the queen side. So you're going to want to play a6, b5, and get queenside space. And to restrict that, inevitably, white's going to usually play a4 to try to discourage b5, right? So, black's play is usually on the queen side, maybe the center, and the most dangerous ideas for white are usually on the king side, playing a quick f4, perhaps f5 or e5, and attacking over there. For example, the flick knife attack is very dangerous. To show you what that is, d4, knight f6, c4. So here we begin the modern Benoni, and here f4 begins the flick knife attack, as it's called. Bishop g7, bishop b5, knight f d7. For example, knight f3, and white just goes for oftentimes a Grand Prix-like attack. And I say that, let's just say, for instance, castle, now castle, say a6. A lot of times white will play something like f5, followed by queen e1, bishop f4, bishop g5, knight g5, queen h4, and trying to just checkmate you, basically. If you remember the Grand Prix lecture or you've played those positions, it'll look pretty familiar, right? You have f4, f5, and you just kind of throw pieces over to the king side and try to checkmate black. Okay. And even if you don't play the Benoni as black, it's worth knowing the structure because, for example, if you play the English as white, this is a common structure you can end up in. Curiously enough, it usually ends up from the Queen's Gambit declined. Just to show you what I mean, let's go all the way back. So let's say, for example, you play the English. The structure often happens like so. Castle, whoops. So let's just say, for instance, something like this. So if you notice, it's basically just a reversed Benoni structure, right? So if you play the English as white, this is going to be an important pawn structure for you to understand. The same ideas apply. So just because you don't play the modern Benoni doesn't mean you should ignore that kind of pawn structure. We'll get into that next time. The Carlsbad structure is very famous too. Now this typically happens from a Queen's Gambit declined, although it can also happen from a Slav. So let's go back to the beginning. So let's say d4, d5, c4, e6. The big way this happens is c takes, and for example, let's say this, and we end up with the exact same pawn structure. So an exchange Queen's Gambit decline often ends up in this kind of position. Now, many of you might know this because it's so famous, but white's big idea here is to play b4, a4, b5, and exchange off the a and b pawns, and saddle black with this weak backward pawn on c6. The idea then will be you say double rooks on the c file and then just win it, right? That's a dream anyway. Typically white's play is not on the king side. I say typically because it's not always the case. For example, let's go back here. After knight c3, you'll find that many grandmasters decide to play bishop b7 here. Just for example, in the most recent U.S. championship, there was a game between Wesley So and Varuj Jacobian here. Jacobian was black and played bishop e7. And the game took on this kind of quirky, kind of crazy play. And the reason for playing bishop e7, by the way, is that if you play knight f6, it allows white to play bishop g5, say bishop e7, take, say queen c2. The big idea behind this line for white is that white can develop the knight to e2. So this is the exception where white will commonly attack on the king side. So white's idea here is to play f3, castle, e4, and get space in the center, aim to play e5 eventually, and attack on the king side. So this is one instance where the minority attack is not white's big idea. But generally speaking, it is the most classical way. So by the way, just going back to bishop e7, the reason black plays this is because white has to commit the knight to f3 now. The other idea is to take on d5. But the big problem with taking on d5 is that it lets black's bishop get to the f5 square. So for example, if e takes d5, and you play bishop f4, c6, black's going to get that bishop to f5. And if you think you're going to stop it, you're not. Okay, queen c2, black can play g6. And bishop f5 is going to come with tempo anyway. So after bishop e7, white's kind of in a pickle because if you take on d5, you open up the bishop on c8. And if you play knight f3, you can no longer put knight on e2 and play f3, right? So now black can play knight f6 and be happy since that option is not available. So anyway, what do you do with your pieces? As far as black's concerned, there's one thing that's really important. It's that you want to get a knight to the d6 square. So it can happen a couple different ways. One is with the king's knight. So I guess going back here is the best way to look at it. Let's say bishop g5, castle, take, e3. So black's knight can get to d6 from f6 via e8 or e4. So for example, let's say c6, bishop d3. A common move you'll see here is knight e4. By the way, the tactic is that you're attacking the bishop on g5, so you're not losing a pawn on e4. For example, takes, black takes, and white's actually losing a piece here because you lose the bishop that way there, or if you take on e7, you're just getting forked, right? So for example here, wait, not bishop f6, bishop e7, queen e7, and the knight usually retreats back to d6. So that's one way. And another way is using the knight on b8. So that can happen here, for example, by knight a6, castle, and knight c7, and the knight can go to e8 and then d6. So that's another way it can reach that square. Another possibility, yet another one, is through getting it to f5. So that happens commonly, for example, through castle, let's say rook e8. Let's say something like this. And then I can go to g7, then f5, and then d6. Now it is a very roundabout way, but it is another way that knight can reach that square. So anyway, the knight on d6 is so important for a couple reasons. One is that it helps protect against white playing b4, b5, because on d6 it controls the b5 square. So you can play your pawn to a6, your knight on d6, and it'll be controlling the b5 square 3 times. So that really helps delay white's b4, b5 advance. Also, a common idea for white here is to play something like knight a4 or knight c5 to attack b7. And if you play knight on d6, then b7 is just defended. And yet another reason to put knight on d6 is that I already mentioned that minority attack with b4, b5 is important. Well, white can do that, but now you always have the possibility of putting your knight on c4. For example, in this position, black could play like b5, followed by knight c4. And the c pawn is not going to be weak because the c file will be closed. Your knight's going to be on c4, solidly defended by 2 pawns, and there'll be nothing white can do to kick it off. So that's an important idea too. And by the way, if you ever get the knight to c4, then you can attack the pawn on e3 in case white tries to play f3 or f4. And finally, another thing that knight on d6 does is it helps support a kingside attack. So it defends the e4 square, it defends f5, so you could, for example, play b4, f5, and attack on the king side. So the knight on d6 is just a very important square for the knight. Generally speaking, if you can get a knight there, you're going to be in a pretty healthy position. So that's a very important idea for the Carlsbad structure. Now, I also have some ideas to show you in the Maroczy bind, but I'll cover that next time. And in the meantime, if you want to delve into a pawn structure that I haven't covered, or one of these that I covered briefly here, just let me know. But that's it for today.